of your experiences in the same places that they experienced theirs 200 years ago. I'd like to acknowledge, though, before the long expedition moseyed through here, there were a lot of people who are already living here, and we know that if we whatever we might call them, American Indians, indigenous Indians, whatever, we want to do it with respect. And I think, well, I'll get to that. I think I should just make an acknowledgement that comes from me, and if you agree with this, we'll go right on. We must acknowledge that the lands on which we live were taken from those who lived here before us, especially people of the Pawnee, Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. It is ironic that the long expedition came in peace in order to learn about the social, material, and spiritual cultures, the languages, and lifestyle of the natives that they met. And yet, these explorers in the long expedition also sought knowledge of the mineral, hydrological, agricultural promise of the land, which was eventually taken from the indigenous people. So we live with irony, and off we go. The introduction, just to give you a little background of what was going on in the US at this time and what motivated this particular expedition. President James Monroe was inaugurated in 1817. He and Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, were deeply concerned about British influence on trade with Native Americans in the fur-rich Northwest portion of the Louisiana Purchase, what we call the Northwest today. Calhoun proposed a 1,000-man military foray to the upper Missouri River to establish the US presence and to guard the newly negotiated but extremely porous northern border. Congress approved a large expenditure for the plan, and it began in 1818, the military portion. Now, beyond the military, the president and the secretary expressed the needs for research into the scientific and cultural attributes of the little-known Western land and its native people. Army engineer Major Stephen H. Long solicited Calhoun for later leadership of a small group of learned explorers sent out to gather information that would go far beyond that had been gained by the 1804 to 1806 Lewis and Clark expedition and that of Zebulon Pike, who came to the very places that the long expedition is headed. And Zebulon Pike's expedition was in 1806, but without the research that the long expedition intended to provide. Congress approved Long's expedition to the upper Missouri from 1819 and 1820. Both military and scientific expeditions were forced in fall 1819 to winter on the lower Missouri near today's Omaha, Nebraska. The Western Engineer, the small steamboat of Long's design, had many mechanical problems throughout its journey from Pittsburgh in 1819. Congress and the press expressed great disappointment with the progress of the expedition. To make matters worse, the US was falling into deep economic downturn. Major Long, after both expeditions arrived in, well, not too many miles away from Omaha, Nebraska, Major Long made a several-month journey back to Washington, realizing, I think, that his dream for this expedition at least the second half of the expedition, was falling apart. And so he went back to Washington to lobby hard for the continuation of the scientific expedition. He returned in June with 2 new expedition members whom you will meet just very briefly. Cut short in time and money, Long's itinerary for 1820 would take his party up the Platte River from the Missouri to the Rocky Mountains and down the Arkansas and Red Rivers to Journey's End at Fort Smith, Arkansas. So what I'm going to try and give you from quite a long, lengthy, as in 3-volume, huge 3-volume account of the expedition is the nutshell version. I'm calling it a travel log, although it wasn't definitely wasn't a happy vacation. It was productive, let's put it that way. So here's the title page from the account, that huge 3-volume account. And as you can see, it says from Pittsburgh to the Rocky Mountains. That's where the Western Engineer steamboat slowly, with many mechanical problems, chug, chug, chug down the Ohio, up the Mississippi to the Missouri, and up the Missouri and to their wintering place at what they called the Engineer Cantonment. So this was all put together, of course, by order of John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, under the command of Major Stephen H. Long. In the small print there, if you can't read it, from the notes, in other words, drawn from the notes of Major Long, Mr. Thomas Say, who was one of the scientists, and other gentlemen of the exploring party, and compiled by Edwin James, who spent several years putting it all together. He was also the botanist, geologist for the expedition, and what's left off there is he was also the physician, pardon me, and a man of many, many skills, a young man of many, many skills. Stephen Long, and I hope all of you can read down below because I'm just going to skip over much of this, but he was the boss. He designed and built the steamboat, and he was the commander and the topographer and cartographer for the most important thing. One of the most important things for the expedition was mapping. There were 2 men who have not had portraits painted of them. I haven't been able to find them, nor have authors who have written about them. So the second in command was Captain John Bell. He was not second in command for the first portion of the expedition, but he was for the second. Well, I won't go into what happened to the second in command, but he was as you'll see, he was the commander of the return party, which went down the Arkansas River. He was also, I think you'll enjoy hearing some of his journals, because he was the official journalist, and he kept track of the courses on the degrees of 360 degrees. He kept track of the courses he was on and the mileage guide, and the mileage that they traveled. Another young man to help with cartography and topography was Lieutenant William H. Swift. And Swift had left West Point before he even graduated. And he was essentially drafted into the expedition to be Long's right-hand man. Edwin James, I've already mentioned his name. At 23 years old, he was already a physician. He was an expert botanist and had studied some as a geologist, and he kept a journal as well. And Thomas Say, whom I've already mentioned. Thomas Say was probably the most successful and intelligent scientist on the trip. He was a zoologist, an ethnographer. He was working on collecting information from the natives that they met. And a journalist. He kept a journey of his own. as well as traveling with Long on other expeditions. Titian Ramsay Peale was even younger than Edwin James. He was 19 years old and a remarkable young man. He had already been on one scientific exploring expedition down to Georgia and Florida, and here he was on another one. But his other skills, as you see on the bottom line, he was a naturalist, as well as an artist, a botanical and biological artist, a marksman, heck of a good shot, and a hunter. And then here was the experienced artist and painter, Samuel Seymour. And we'll see much of his work as we go through. Here's one of Titian Peale's drawings of the Western Engineer, which is the one that's up to steam there on the left. This is in winter, in their winter dock along the Missouri River in February. It's a strange looking little steamboat, and it had some very interesting design, and it was all Major Long's idea. Now, as I go through, I'm going to be sharing particularly quotes from Edwin James and from John Bell, Captain Bell, second in command. So I'll just mention their name, and then I hope you can follow along with the quotations as I cut in and out between them. Thursday, June 1, 1820. Here we go on the travelogue. Edwin James. In an early part of June 1820, arrangements were completed for the departure of the exploring expedition from their winter cantonment near Council Bluff. By an order of the Honorable Secretary of War dated 28 February, Major Long had been instructed to explore the country from the Missouri westward to the Rocky Mountains, and thence proceeding south along the base of these mountains to the Arkansas to dispatch a division of his party down that river. Tuesday, June 6th to Saturday, June 10. These entries come from those dates. At 11 o'clock, June 6th, the Long expedition of 20 men set out from the steamboat Western Engineer, which had wintered near the confluence of the Missouri and Platte rivers. Edwin James. Indians visiting at the nearby trading post laugh at our temerity in attempting what they said we should never be able to accomplish. Similar warnings come from trader Barony Vasquez, who accompanied the Pike expedition in 1806. With these prospects and with very inadequate outfit, which was the utmost our united means enabled us to furnish, we departed, ascending the Platte River. The men, not being very expert or skillful with horse riding and packing, are forced to stop and secure loads. The party covers only 9 miles on June 6 and 16 miles on June 7, but soon the party will be averaging 25 miles per day, except for most Sundays, which are the days of rest, artwork, and scientific observation. Sunday, June 11 to Wednesday, June 13. The expedition visits 3 separate Pawnee villages. And here a painting by Samuel Seymour of a council with many of the Pawnee. The villages were named, or of the tribes, the Grand Pawnee, the Republican Pawnee, not what you're thinking, the Republican River, Pawnee, and the Pawnee Loops, the name from the Loop River, the Wolf River. Each consists of a large round domed lodges constructed of mud on a wooden frame. Sizable agricultural fields extend out from each village, for the Pawnee were an agricultural culture. And many pastures are also spread out for grazing thousands of horses. Most hospitable are the Loups, their chief, Latalesha, and his famed son, Petalachero. And here's a picture of Petalachero that was painted 1 year after the long expedition passed through by a very fine painter named Charles Burricane. Despite their brief time among the Pawnee, which was only 2 days or so, as directed in Long's orders, Captain Bell, the artists, and Thomas Say gather a good deal of data about the manners, customs, and traditions of the various tribes. Here, guide and interpreter Joseph Bijou and Abraham Ledoux, hunter and interpreter, join the party to play important roles in the journey. Wednesday, June 14 to Thursday, June 22. The journey ascending the Platte was hardly notable, except that members at times exist on short rations already early in the expedition, short rations of 2/3 of a hardtack biscuit per day. Bon appetit. Oh, and another thing, it rained a lot. Despite diligent searches by the hunters, wild game is scarce. Buffalo, pronghorn, and sometimes turkeys provide the foundations of their diet. Buffalo dung often fuels their campfires, as trees are hard to find during the first 150-mile stretch of prairie that the expedition travels. On the eventful morning of June 22, the explorers locate the confluence of the South Platte and the North Platte. Looking for a crossing a few miles up the North Platte, they sight 2 elk crossing the river without swimming. John Bell, the major, and 2 of the party took off their clothes and waded nearly across in order to find the shoalest place of the river to cross. Edwin James, using the same place the elk had taken and putting a part of our baggage in a skin canoe, we waded across, leading our horses, and arrived safely on the other side, no accident having happened. Heading up the Platte, they climb an elevated swale running parallel to the river. Edwin James, we see before us upon the broad expanse of the left margin of the river, immense herds of bisons grazing undisturbed and obscuring with the density of their numbers the verdant plain. To the right, as far as the eyes were permitted to rove, the crowd seemed not to diminish. And it would be no exaggeration to say that at least 10,000 here burst in on our sight in an instant. In the morning, we again sought the living picture, but upon all the plain, which last evening was so teeming with noble animals, not one remained. Friday, June 23 to Friday, June 30. As they go, the naturalists, as we call the 4 scientists on the expedition, the naturalists note signs of pronghorn, beaver, bald eagle, badgers, swift fox, and hares, and many other creatures unnamed. Seymour and Peel sketch many of these animals and plants. James identifies purple prairie clover, bee plant, beard tongue, milk fetch, and the showy white evening primrose. He also notes, being the geologist in the party, he also notes his crystalline feldspar in the river as the first convincing evidence of the primitive character of the Rocky Mountains. For scientists at that time were unsure of the composition of the whole mountain range. Many other expedition members find the hot, expansive prairie thirst-inducing and dull. Large herds of buffalo appear often, keeping the hunters busy. The meat, whether fresh or jerked, becomes the explorer's favorite food. However, among the officers and naturalists grows another affinity for the bison. In the official account to the Secretary of War, James writes, "It would be highly desirable that some law for the preservation of game might be extended and rigidly enforced in the country where the bison is still met with, that the wanton destruction of these valuable animals by the white hunters might be checked and prevented." In a country to which the meaning of the word conservation is almost unknown, the Long expedition made one of the first calls for wildlife conservation to higher representatives of the US government. If only their call had been heard. On the evening of June 27, a large circular wall built of cottonwood limbs and logs is found. It is a Pawnee fortified camp. Titian Peale's watercolor, Pawnee Indian Fort in the Platte Valley, depicts the scene. You'll see, if you can see that carefully enough, that Peale had not put soldiers or scientists in the picture, but some of the Pawnee that he imagined had been there shortly. And if you could see inside the fort there, where the smoke is rising, there are several others. And on the little pole right in the forward center, why, that's what they found were scalps that had been taken by the Pawnee on a warpath. On the evening of July, I already read that. A rifle shot awakens the men before dawn. They scramble to secure the horses and run to their assigned defensive stations. Edwin James. Major Long informed us the alarm had been given by his order and was intended to test the coolness and self-possession of the party in preparation for a serious attack from the Indians. What Long did not know is that the expedition would not encounter any natives for another month. That spring, several tribes, including some of the Pawnee Loups, several tribes headed to the southern plains and gathered together to fight the Spanish. At 8 a.m. on June 30, on an elevated part of the prairie, a debate begins among the company. Is that a line of clouds they see through the hazy morning? Or one of those mirages that keep fooling them? Or is it the sight that they've been yearning most to see after almost a month of slow prairie travel? As the atmosphere clears through the day, the debate is easily settled. Yes, that irregular, unmoving line of white stretched across the horizon is the Rocky Mountains. Edwin James. We soon remarked a particular part of the range divided into 3 conic summits, each apparently of nearly equal altitude. The 3 summits, mapped and named by Long as simply highest peak, are today Mount Meeker, Mount Lady Washington, and Long's Peak. Long, however, did not name the peak for himself. That came later from members of the expedition. Saturday, July 1, and to Monday, July 3. Samuel Seymour captures the mountain scope in his drawing, Distant View of the Rocky Mountains. And on the left center, hopefully you can see the three conic points that came to be called the highest peak. The picture, as far as we know, is the first one made of the Rocky Mountain Range. During the expedition, Major Long and Lieutenant Swift regularly attempt astronomic observations to determine their exact longitudinal location for mapping purposes. Afternoon clouds, often accompanied by heavy rains, frequently thwart their readings in June and July. Holding steady to a southwestern route, angling toward the mountains, on July 3rd, they crossed three substantial streams originating on high from the mountains. Today we know them as the Cashlaputa, Big Thompson, and St. Vrain, and the creek where they encamped that night was the St. Vrain. Tuesday, July 4, and Thursday, July 6. The 4th, Edwin James. We had hoped to celebrate our great national festival on the Rocky Mountains, but the day had arrived and we were still at a distance. Being extremely impatient of any unnecessary delay, which prevented us from the examination of the mountains, we did not devote the day to rest. In celebration of the day, Long orders an extra pint of corn delivered to the messes and a gill of whiskey for each man to drink the birthday of the American independence. Waxing patriotic in unusually emotional language, Captain Bell writes in his journal that day, "May the same spirit of patriotism and love of country be perpetuated until time shall be no more." He then returns to his plain speech to conclude the entry, stating, "We passed the remainder of the day in feasting on boiled corn soup, roasted venison, and buffalo." Shorter days on the 4th and 5th of July allow afternoon time for scientific discovery and picture making. Seymour captures the Rockies featuring highest peak, which is just disappearing on the right-hand portion of your screen, whereas the mountain range on the left-hand portion of your screen is the Indian Peaks. Several days, time for scientific discovery and picture making. Seymour captures the highest peaks and others. Peel sketches scarlet gilia in full bloom. Say studies prairie dogs and catches rattlesnakes barehanded. James provides the first scientific description of a long-leafed cottonwood, a tree first noted in passing by Lewis and Clark in 1804. Crossing the streams now named Cherry Creek and Bear Creek, those are, of course, are the names we give them today. On July 6, the expedition finally draws close to the mountains. John Bell. About 11 o'clock, we arrived within 1/4 mile of the gap between the mountains where issued the southwest branch of the River Platte, beyond which there was no possibility of advancing with horses. Our party encamped on a small plain of the river bottom, which afforded good feed for our horses, a number of large cottonwood trees to shade us from the rays of the sun, and good cool water from the river. The long expedition had reached the Rocky Mountains at last. And this, I've tried to restrain myself from much in the way of opinion, but the next 2 weeks in their time, in my opinion, represents the scientific high points of the entire 1820 expedition. Their arrival at the mouth of the South Platte occurs exactly 1 month to the hour from their departing the engineer cantonment. From there, the total of Bell's daily mileage measurements is 568 miles traveled to this day. Though welcome, the company stays at this scientific and geologic landmark amounts to only a day and a half. Not wasting time, that afternoon, Dr. Say and Captain Bell scramble up through sedimentary strata, what they call the first range of the mountains. Say discovers a new spider and the melodious rock wren, never before identified. They ascend perhaps 1,800 feet through steep terrain, scrubby brushes, and rocky footing. Returning along the south side of the river, they face riverside cliffs, dunks in the wild river, and more thick shrubs. Unfortunately, ripe currant berries they eat do not sit well with either their stomachs or their heads. Friday, July 7 to Sunday, July 9. And here, I'll share with you Samuel Seymour. This is, I think, one of my favorite pictures of his. His view of the chasm through which the Platte issues from the Rocky Mountains, 1820. And there's a place where you could stand even today. And although there are many more trees that show up and much more shrubbery than show up in those days of much more fire to clear away the vegetation, you can find a place that looks very much like this, the shapes of the hills and all. Friday, July 7 to Sunday, July 9. Friday is set aside, as Bell says, to give the scientific gentleman opportunity of making the necessary investigations for an illustration of the natural history of the new and heretofore unexplored region of the country. James, Peel, and 2 others use a safety rope to cross the fast-moving river to access the mountains to the north side of the river, the camp being on the south. They climb through a hot, dry, south-facing region of inclined sandstone formation. Despite the aridity, James identifies a new flower, 9-bark, and a shrub never before identified that we call Rocky Mountain maple. From a high point of the second stage in the metamorphic rock formations, they are awarded with a view to the confluence of the main stem of the South Platte and its North Fork. The climbers also glimpse higher peaks, rather longingly seen to the western horizon. On their difficult descent, the wild berries strike again. One man is stricken so acutely at head and stomach as to be unable to walk for a while. All return to camp by dark, finding many there also sick after consuming berries. Dr. James blames not the berries, but that the stomach by long disuse had in a great measure lost the power of digesting fruit. And who knows, maybe he was right. The seeming difficulty of traversing great canyons and mountains to the west likely influences the future course of the expedition, although we do not know for certain. John Bell, in his journal, the commanding officer does not intend that the party shall proceed to the sources of the Platte, but are now to proceed along the base of the mountains to the south, and until we strike upon the Arkansas River on the way, to examine particularly the high peak of the mountains described by Pike in his tour to the source of the Arkansas and Platte. The expedition's late departure in June, diminishing food quantity and quality, and the condition of the men and horses may have impacted Long's decision, which ran counter to the February orders from the Secretary of War. Both before and after this pioneering trek, though, we do know that Major Long had a reputation for enforcing a speedy pace on all of his journeys. Geology takes center for the journalists on Saturday morning. With a company abandoning the Platte, Edwin James describes a stream that lies from south to north along a narrow valley, bounded on each side by high cliffs of sandstone that appear as if broken off and thrown into an inclined position by some convulsion which changed the relative elevation of their stratum. In his in this hypothesis, James is far ahead of the geologists of his time in identifying that he was viewing the upthrust of the Rocky Mountains. And what about those upthrust mountains that were made of sandstone? Can you guess what valley? It's a very small valley. What valley through cliffs of sandstone he might be talking about? I'll give you a hint. Likely the stream is Willow Creek. And the standing stones, as we might call them, the hogbacks, as we call them today, are in and near where? I can't hear what you're saying, but I hope you're guessing. And some of you are guessing maybe Roxborough State Park. So that's correct. John Bell. Our party traveled along outside the second range and occasionally passed an opening made by the outlet of a rivulet from the mountain, where we had new and very interesting views of insulated masses of rock laying in the valley of singular color and formation. The whole scenery picturesque and romantic. Now, can you guess what kind of land formations John Bell is referring to when he says insulated, not insulated, as we say with our houses and so forth, but insulated, as in insular, as in an island, masses of rock like islands in the valley of singular color and formation. I think maybe you're starting to guess what he's talking about. It's the buttes of southern Douglas County. The troop encamped for the night on what they call Defile Creek, today's West Plum Creek, near the west base of Dawson Butte. And that may be another familiar landmark with you, although they did not give it the name of Dawson Butte. I'm going to take a stretch. I'm going to take a drink of water. I'm talking a lot, but if some of you want to stand very quickly, take a quick stretch or whatever you need, I'll be back with a view from Sunday the 9th in just a second. Sunday, excuse me, Sunday the 9th, a day of rest. It hardly is, but very busy. And I think it gives you a wonderful picture of what a day was like, a day especially when they were in camp, a day was like for the expedition. Sunday the 9th. Dr. James bleeds some of the men feeling ill. Bleeds, yes. Bleeding is a supposed cure for the effects of high elevation. Don't try it at home. Or maybe it's a cure for too many berries. At any rate, he bled a number of the men who were feeling ill. Major Long and Lieutenant Swift make a steep and strenuous ascent over the disintegrating horizontal strata of Dawson Butte and are surprised to find hard greenstone, volcanic rhyolite, layering the flat top of what we call the butte. Taking berries from the summit, they spy the high peak in the Arkansas River Valley that Captain Pike recorded in 1806. Seymour, Peel, and James probe the upper reaches of Defile Creek through fossil-bearing standing stones of the current, another place some of you may be familiar with, Perry Park. And here again, these stones and mountainsides covered with trees, but you can see this very same scene in Perry Park today. Seymour captures the formations so realistically that you can identify them today. And this is the picture, of course, he painted. They note a succession of beaver ponds strung along the creek as they went. And then, following cascading Bear Creek, they trek upward 1,000 feet or more into the Rampart Range, as we call it, to a viewpoint of the Butte country below. And on the way down, Say names two fine birds, beautiful band-tailed pigeon and blue grouse. Monday, July 10 to Wednesday, July 12. Edwin James. The 10th. From our encampment, we traveled nearly south and crossing a small ridge, dividing the waters of the Platte from those of the Arkansas, halted to dine on a tributary of the Arkansas. In an excursion from this place, we collected a large species of columbine. It is heretofore unknown to the flora of the United States, to which it forms a splendid acquisition. If it should appear not to have been described before, it may receive the name of Aquilegia cerealia. And whose state flower? Here's the easiest question I have of all to ask. Whose state flower is that today? I'm not even going to answer that question, for you all know. Captain Bell describes a pond as they came across the divide, now Palmer Lake, with waters flowing both north and south from the divide. And another interesting feature lay nearby. Captain Bell. To the southeast from this divide is situated a monument from 200 to 400 feet high, resembling the standing walls of an extensive edifice in ruins. The commanding officer gave it the name of Castle Rock, now known as Elephant Rock, and the nearby rivulet the name of Castle Rock Creek. Mr. Seymour has a well-executed view of this. There it is, again, without the covering of trees all around. There it is, what they saw of Monument Creek in the foreground and Elephant Rock in the back. The sinuous creek, Monument Creek, Castle Rock Creek, leads them to a camp in the pines that day within today's Air Force Academy. There's plenty of buffalo meat for dinner, and the hunters, when they come in, report seeing a white bear, most likely a grizzly. On July 9 and 10, as July 9 and 10 are remarkable for discoveries, the 11th is filled with error and ultimately frustration to some degree. James misidentifies, not something he often did, but James misidentifies the Gamble Oak and Ponderosa Pine. Heading south on Castle Rock Creek, they halt to rest and see, as Bell describes, a high snow-caped mountain in sight, which seems to be within the range along the base of which we are traveling. Not looking a gift horse in the mouth, however, the company continues south for hours, coming into view of the Spanish mountains, Spanish peaks. Joseph Bijou, their guide, exclaims to Major Long, "We have passed the peak. It was the mountain covered with snow, which we saw at 12 o'clock. The following morning, as Bell states in military fashion, in order to afford such of the scientific gentlemen who choose an opportunity to visit the high peak, the commanding officer ordered a retrograde movement of our party, which commenced at 6 o'clock a.m. Near their campground that morning, with a high peak view, Say discovers a beautifully colored lesser goldfinch and numerous insects. Thursday, July 13, and to Saturday, July 15. Exactly, as I hinted before, exactly 200 years ago to this day, the 13th of July, we're going to turn to Edwin James' narrative of his high country adventure. At an early hour of the morning of the 13th, Lieutenant Swift, accompanied by the guide, was dispatched from camp to measure a base near the peak and to make there a part of the observations requisite for calculating its elevation. Dr. James, being furnished with 4 men, 2 to be left at the foot of the mountain to take care of the horses, and 2, Zachariah Wilson and Joseph Verplanck, to accompany him in the proposed ascent to the summit of the peak. Visiting the beautiful and refreshing fountain, the boiling spring, you know the one. The party dines on venison and bison ribs, hangs some spare provisions in a juniper tree, and takes leave of the 4 left behind and below. Edwin James. We 3 climbers carried with us each a small blanket, 10 or 12 pounds of bison meat, 3 gills of parched cornmeal, and a small kettle. In ascending, we found the surface in many places covered with a loose and crumbling granite, rolling from under our feet and rendering the ascent extremely difficult. After clambering with extreme fatigue over about 2 miles, we halted at sunset in a cluster of trees. In the morning, we suspend clothing, blankets, and food that could be dispensed with, except about 3 pounds of bison flesh, and continued our ascent, hoping to be able to reach the summit of the peak and return to the same camp in the evening. Like the cog railway of later days, James' route continues to follow Boiling Springs Creek, today's Ruxton Creek, and then heads up the ever steepening ridge between Ruxton and Lion Creeks to the summit ridge, about 2,500 feet below the peak. Exhausted near tree limit at about 2 o'clock, James and Verplanck stop to rest, eat, and wait for Wilson, who is dragging behind. At that spot, James hears ee, ee, shrill squeaks, and observes a small rock-dwelling animal that he compares to a prairie dog or ground squirrel. But it wasn't a prairie dog or ground squirrel. I think some of you can guess what it was. A pika. Even knowing that they will not reach their camp by nightfall, they cannot persuade themselves to turn back from that place, wherever the consequences. With no sign of Wilson, they head uphill. Other than unknown Native American climbers, probably the first to summit Pikes Peak. Theirs is the first known climb of Pikes Peak. Edwin James. A little above the point where the timber disappears entirely, commences a region of astonishing beauty and of great interest on account of its productions. The intervals of soil are sometimes extensive and are covered by a carpet of low but brilliantly flowering alpine plants. We are under the disagreeable necessity of passing by numbers of other flowers. Even with his hasty pace, James collected more than a dozen previously unidentified alpine plants that were later described by the famed botanist John Torrey. It was about 4 o'clock p.m. when we arrived at the summit. We had not been long when we were rejoined by Wilson. The weather was calm and clear, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Though staying only about an hour, James' observations in all directions are extensive and perceptive. Discovering permafrost in the ground, tracing the valleys of the upper Arkansas and Platte rivers, an immense mass of snow and ice on the north slope of the mountain. And as James says, we were surprised to observe the air in every direction filled with such clouds of grasshoppers as partially to obscure the day. They extended upward from the summit to the mountain to the utmost limit of vision in the sky. And as the sun shone brightly, they could be seen by the glittering of their wings at a very considerable distance. Now, this is probably the toughest question. It amazed me when first I learned this. What were those insects? And what were they doing at 14,000 feet and above? Well, I'm not going to leave you in suspense, but I'm just going to refer to, if you could see it, it's a book called The Natural History of the Long Expedition to the Rocky Mountains by Howard Ensign Evans, who's a wonderful naturalist. And this is how he answers the question of those insects and their strange behavior. Beyond doubt, these were migrating swarms of the now extinct Rocky Mountain locust. Remains of these grasshoppers can still be found frozen in glaciers on several peaks in the Rockies, though the last living specimen was seen in 1902. Amazing. Lost in the gathering dark, the mountaineers kindle a fire, lie down only in their clothes, and due to fatigue, sleep the greater part of the night away. After dawn, a dense column of smoke guides them to the same site in which they camped 2 nights before. Their unattended campfire has burned grass, trees, and into most of their provisions, blankets, and clothing, the things that they left suspended. Back at Long's encampment, the mountaineers arrive a little after dark, having completed the excursion within the time prescribed. Major Long is surely pleased to receive all of James' geographic information for his map. And on his map, Long named Pikes High Peak as James Peak. As you can see, I think, in the caption of the photo before you. Sunday, July 16 to Tuesday, July 18. After a hot and dusty trek to the Arkansas River, about to about 10 miles west of Pueblo, the commander allows 2 days for Bell, James, and 2 others to travel west a bone-jarring 34 miles on Monday to the outlet of the Arkansas at the mouth of Royal Gorge. Bivouacked next to the riverbank, John Bell describes the place as the grandest and most romantic scenery I ever beheld. He bemoans having to omit likely scientific discoveries that might be found in this place. Though cramped for time, James did make a number of astute geological observations on the trek out and the trek back to camp. Wednesday, July 19, and to Monday, July 24. Edwin James, the 19th. This morning, we turned our backs upon the mountains and began to move down the Arkansas. It is not without a feeling of regret that we found our long contemplated visit to these grand and interesting objects was now at an end. At a ford in the Arkansas, probably today's Rocky Ford, John Bell notes, "Here the commanding officer intends dividing our party, one to descend the Arkansas, the other to proceed south in quest of the Red River. Bell is to command the Arkansas division, with Long directing the other. On July 24, the separate parties embark on 2 grueling, near 1,000-mile journeys, not to reunite until September 13, 1820. Both groups will suffer severe privations of hunger, heat, and thirst over the next 6 weeks." All the explorers are assumed to have survived the expedition, although the fate of 3 thieving soldiers who deserted Bell's Arkansas group has never been determined. They stole heirlooms of Thomas Say's biological specimens and writings of Native American languages and customs. Those things have never been recovered. Over 2 centuries, politicians and historians have lambasted Stephen Long for mistaking the Canadian River for the Red River, for creating a myth, the myth of the Great American Desert, which in fact, both Bell and Long and James named in their journals, the Great American Desert, which made many, many wistful settlers and politicians very upset. At any rate, they blamed them also for failing to be as successful as Lewis and Clark. And it sounds like hail is starting to come on my roof, so I'm just about to finish up. Yet the scientific and artistic accomplishments of all the expedition members are numerous. I think they were groundbreakers, and they have been long-lived, 200 years worth. So thank you for letting me share a portion of the bicentennial of the Long Expedition with you. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to the Douglas Land Conservancy, especially to Amy Graziano for keeping the pictures on the screen and her own picture, which I see just came up, and for bringing this program to you. Thank you, Amy. And thank you to the Douglas Land Conservancy. I'm going to put a couple of other things up on the screen here for you to view if there are any, while we're dealing with any questions, if there are any. This is advertising for another free program featuring Edwin James, but also Julia Archibald Holmes that's coming up. I'll leave it up there for a while and you can read it. Nice. Go ahead, Amy.
I'm gonna start with the questions, and I have been getting texts that people are losing power in our region, and you said you have hail, I have heavy rain, so hopefully we still have a good connection. Someone wants to know, just curious, where does the Platte come out of the mountains? Do you know?
Yes, it comes out of the mountains just west of Chatfield Reservoir. That's the biggest landmark. There's also, oh shoot, I'm trying to remember the name of the little town that is in fact just where the city of Denver takes their water out into the water in the Highline Canal came out for now more than a century. Waterton, yeah, Waterton is the little settlement there. So just upstream from the upper end of Chatfield Reservoir.
Okay, thank you. A few other questions. Can you tell a little bit about how such an esteemed group was formed?
It was by invitation, basically. What I didn't mention, I talked about Bell and James coming in the second part of the expedition. The doctor and naturalist, botanist on the first part of the expedition didn't survive even to make to the winter cantonment. He was ill when it started, and he begged off when they were still along the Mississippi River, and he died 5 days after that. So at any rate, that's how James came to be part. Bell, I sort of hinted at this before. The second in command did not get along with Stephen Long at all. They got into almost fistfights, and he quit. He was supposed to be the journalist. He gave up being the journalist. Bell did a wonderful job of journaling that never got to anybody, to Secretary Calhoun, to the War Department, to Edwin James. It never got there for some reason, and that reason is unknown. But it has been resurrected, found in some people's hands who recognize it as a marvelous piece of history. And so Bell's journal, we're glad to have had Bell along, because I tried to make him a character with my voice a little bit. And if you read his writing, it's really wonderful, because his style fluctuates from page to page, from journal entry to journal entry. So I don't even think I answered that question, did I?
Yeah, by invitation, basically. And
by invitation.
Yeah, and generally how some of them joined on.
And especially for young Mr. Peel, he being 19 years old, 19. He being 19 years old, he was anxious. He wanted to go. I mean, his father was the famous painter, Charles Wilson Peel. And by the way, I didn't share, but the portraits I showed you at the beginning of the expedition members were all painted by Charles Wilson Peel before they left in 1819 at the beginning of the expedition from Pittsburgh.
Okay, another question. There's a few more. If you want to add them in chat or Q&A, or either works. If you need to drop off, thank you so much for participating, but John's going to stick around a little bit and answer some questions. I'm going to follow up with the recording of this evening's program. So if you want to review or share, feel free. John, anything you want to add about the recording, about your material or anything?
Just this one here, and then what they've already gotten, thanks to Amy. So this is the bibliography, and this is not the only these are not the only books, but these are 7 books that have been just absolutely, what do I want to say? I'm running out of words here. This happens when you talk for an hour and a half. Not
Essential.
essential. Thank you, Carol. My wife just, she knows what to do when I run out of words. Essential.
Finish each other's sentences. That's good. All right, another question. Where and when did Bell and Long's split parties meet?
They met right where they were intended to meet, which was at where the Arkansas River meets the Mississippi River, and at Fort. Here I go. My brain's going too. And yeah, right where the Arkansas meets the Mississippi.
Okay.
What's that, Arkansas? Or what's the name of that big city in Arkansas? Oh, well, you know. So pardon me. I'm getting a little giddy. Shortness of breath, whatever.
One more question.
Right.
Fort Smith. Someone said Fort Smith. Is that correct?
Yes, Fort Smith is right. Give that.
Thank you, Susan.
Give that person a gold medal.
Okay.
I read it at the beginning of the program. I couldn't remember it at the end. Go ahead.
Okay, one more question. Let me see where it went. Okay, can you tell us how the Platte was named? Someone said they had heard that it was named because of the French word flat, and they've heard from others that it was named after someone named Platte. Do you know which is true?
The one I've heard most often is the first, is the French traders. Well, even Bijou and the other guy. There we go again. Even those guys were French traders and trappers. 1820 was not early for the English and the French Canadian trappers, not at all. For American trappers, which was really what a lot of the economic aspects of all this is about, it was something that the U.S. government wanted to move into, which was the fur business, which meant having to send trappers, which meant that they wouldn't be bushwhacked by people from the Hudson's Bay Company and so forth. The people who were working essentially on the auspices of Great Britain. So I don't think I answered that question either, but.
Well, so you think it's.
The Platte, that's, I think, yes, I think French word Platte.
One more question, then maybe we'll wrap it up, or a comment more. Maybe you know something about this. One of our attendees is sharing that later, where the Arkansas meets the Mississippi, Long went on to build a federal marine hospital in Napoleon, Arkansas. You know about that in 1850? Just a little.
Yes, he did. He also was he was in the Army Corps of cartographic or map making engineers, but he was a general engineer as well. And I think they all had multiple hats to wear in the Army at that time. There were only a dozen people in the Army engineers at that time. So Bell had been down to Fort Smith and up the Arkansas River a short ways a couple of years before this expedition, before he came back to that place. And he was the engineer for the building of Fort Smith itself before it was occupied by the U.S. Army. And the hospital, that's a little bit farther into his life than I've gone in any depth. But I have no doubt that comment is exactly right.
Well, thank you to Ron and John. Thank you so much for sharing. Let's see. Somebody's recommend. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your research, your expertise, your interpretation. Appreciate it. And I liked how I loved the pieces that connected with right here in our home. And I love that some of the places you shared and that they explored are also protected by DLC. So perfect.
That's a great thing.
Presentation for us to to hear this evening. So if you want to go out and hike in the footsteps of the long expedition, head on out to areas around Perry Park. DLC is in the process of working to protect new Sandstone Ranch, and also Dawson Butte. The Lawns expedition went to Dawson Butte, which you can hike at, and DLC protects, and we believe Spruce Mountain as well. So head on out there and hike. John, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, I'll follow up with the video for everyone. Thank you all.
Happy Bicentennial to you.
Yes, exactly. All right.